So I'm Beth Fisher-Yoshida, the Program Director of the Master of Science in Negotiation and Conflict Resolution at the School of Professional Studies at Columbia University. And this is part of our monthly webinar series, and I'll talk about the webinar in a minute. And just so you know, for those of you joining us, if you would like more information on the NECR Master's Program, please stay on at the end, and our recruiting officer, David Taylor Tumilty, will be happy to answer any questions and give more information about the program. So today I'm going to introduce Julia Vasileva, who will be speaking on women's leadership and empowerment in peace processes in the post-Soviet space, the cases of Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Moldova. And before I give a more formal introduction of Julia, we'll just go to the next slide and I'll share some upcoming events that you're welcome to attend. So on Thursday, April 17th, we're going to have another webinar, and this is with my friend and colleague Camilo Ascarate, who is an ombudsman, and he will be talking about organizational culture as a complex, dynamical system. And for those of you working with or interfacing with any organization, then you will realize, yes, there's a lot of complexity in organizations. On Saturday, May 3rd, we welcome you once again to our capstone presentations, which will be held virtually. And if you can register for that, and we will have some links afterwards in the chat. And on Thursday, May 8th, we have another webinar. It's called The Data Myth, Interrogating the Evidence Base of Evidence-Based Peacebuilding by Roger McGinty and Pamela Furchow. And all of this will be available to you. And I'm going to now introduce Julia. But one other thing, no, this is good for right now. Okay, so Julia and I have been working together for over a year, and I've heard her speak a lot of different times, and is very entertaining and really will inform us a lot about what's taking place in the post-Soviet space and what is it about the post-Soviet space that's so unique. But I'll tell you a little bit about Julia. She's with us now at AC4, the Advanced Consortium for Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity. She's a visiting scholar, and she'll be here for the year. Her institutional affiliation is a research fellow in international law and security studies at Tallinn University in Estonia. And she's now finalizing her PhD on women's leadership and empowerment in peace negotiations in the post-Soviet space in the Eastern Europe and the Caucasus. Her previous education includes a Master of Philosophy in International Relations, a Magister Juris in Law, an MA in EU International Relations and Diplomacy. So in case you're wondering what she's been doing, she's been studying a lot. And professionally, she has worked for the EU Commission and the EU Diplomatic Service and was an external researcher with NATO centers. So the format of the webinar is that Julia will present for about 35 minutes, and then we'll open it up to a little bit of discussion and Q&A. So for you to make comments or write questions, which we definitely encourage you to do, please use the Q&A box because that's available to participants. So I'm going to be quiet now, and I'm going to turn it over to Julia, who will share her slides and will also share information about that, with the content, what she has on her slides. Julia?
Yes, thank you so much, Beth, for this introduction. I'll just share my slides directly to start with the presentation. So I hope you can see my screen now. Is that working? Okay, good. So yes, indeed, I'll be speaking about the topic women's leadership and empowerment in peace processes in the post-Soviet space, the cases of Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Moldova. Since the presentation is rather long, it's almost 35 minutes, I'll dive right in with sort of giving you an overview of the context of the conflicts that I've been studying over the past years. Then I'll give a bit of insight on the fieldwork that I did, and in the end, sort of we can discuss some of my results on, the participation of women in those peace processes, and also reasons for their low levels of inclusion. So my research over the past years has looked into how women lead peace negotiations in the post-Soviet space, and it explores specifically how women participated in high-level negotiations. So a lot of research and scholarship has focused more on, in connection with the women, peace, and security agenda, has focused on women's participation on civil society and grassroots level in peace building. But I was really interested in how do women participate on the leadership level in high-level negotiations, and specifically also why do the numbers why are women still frequently underrepresented in such negotiations? And I was particularly interested in the post-Soviet space, especially since with the start of the war in Ukraine in 2022, that heightened security concerns across post-Soviet Eurasia, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe. And I wanted to really highlight, and I also want to highlight in this presentation, that we see the Ukraine case almost as, or it's often portrayed as if this was an isolated case. And my research argues really that we should look at this region holistically and try to understand the connections and also the common elements of the conflicts that persist in this region, the so-called frozen, or, they're often termed frozen conflicts, but I'll explain why they're often not really that frozen as they are sort of termed. Not just Ukraine, but also Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Moldova are nations that face prolonged conflicts since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, with peace negotiations yielding little progress over the past 30 years. And this region is really shaped by the legacy of the Soviet Union's collapse, and also the persistent Russian influence in this region in its so-called near abroad. There are several, or research shows that there are several benefits of including women in peace building, in peace negotiations, and scholars argue that the post-Soviet region, this post-Soviet Eurasian region, really requires effective negotiations to transition from these zero-sum dynamics to sustainable peace. And I argue also that including women in such negotiations on high level can really contribute to this effort to have effective and sustainable peace initiatives. And as I said, it's really important in my view to, or as I argue, to understand this region and its conflicts holistically. So to not see them only in isolation or certain elements about them, but to have a very good understanding of what is going on, what are the geopolitical realities, and how do they condition also the exclusion of women frequently from the so-called track 1 high-level negotiations in these contexts. So I thought that maybe some people who participate in this webinar, some of the participants in this webinar, might not be so familiar with exactly with what is going on the ground. What are the geopolitics? Where are these countries even that I'll be talking about today? And I therefore created this map of the post-Soviet, space. So we have here the Russian Federation. All of these states sort of emerged from the dissolution of the Soviet Union. We have the Russian Federation. That's obviously an independent country. Then we have the Baltics. That I've marked here in blue, that are NATO members, or they joined NATO after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and also the European Union, so they're aligned very much with the West. We have Belarus, trying to see my mouse right here, that I've made light yellow, also to show that the leadership is quite close to the Russian Federation, so almost like you could term it a Russian proxy. And then we have all these countries that I've made green in this map. So we have Ukraine. Obviously, I think most people are familiar now with what's been going on in the last 3 years. Then we have Moldova. Right here, strategically very important in the southwest of Ukraine, also very close to the port of Odessa. So it's really worth paying attention to what's going on in Moldova. Then we have Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, also with with conflicts. And as I put here on the maps, on the map, I made them green because they are the countries where where conflicts persist since the 1990s, and scholars also often call them the in-betweens, or almost like a buffer zone between the Russian Federation and the West. To give a bit of an overview of each of the conflicts in those countries, just to show this table, and I'm aware that maybe some of you might challenge me on some of the aspects. I'm not trying to oversimplify or overgeneralize, but simply to highlight the commonalities between those conflicts, just to show how we can see they are very comparable in many ways. So. We have Georgia with the separatist regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, Moldova with the Transnistrian region, and Armenia and Azerbaijan with Nagorno-Karabakh region, where we had the conflict since the 1990s. I will not discuss Ukraine today in this webinar, so I'll leave that out. But just to show also in this table that all of these countries are former members of the Soviet Union. We see an escalation of the conflicts in the 1990s after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. In each of these conflict regions, there is a separatist minority that is supported to a different degree by the Russian Federation. Importantly, also for the peace processes, we have Russian troops on the ground in different roles. So in Georgia, this is for support for the unrecognized states. In Moldova, it's also for support of the unrecognized state of Transnistria, or the Transnistrian region. And in Nagorno-Karabakh, they have been there as mediators or so-called peacekeepers. The negotiation process is also quite important to understand when we want to explore why women are excluded, right? We need to know what is the negotiation process. For Georgia, it's the Geneva International Discussions with participation of Georgia, Russia, the US, and representatives from the separatist regions, and co-mediated by the EU, the UN, and the OSCE. For Moldova, it's the so-called 5+2 format, consisting of Moldova, representatives of Transnistrian region, the OSCE, Russia, and Ukraine, and with the US and the EU as observers. And then we have the Minsk group for the Nagorno-Karabakh peace process that has been consisting of Azerbaijan, Armenia, the OSCE, and co-chaired by Russia, France, and the United States. The conflicts also differ to degree of whether they're active or frozen. So Georgia, Moldova have been rather frozen. But compared to Azerbaijan and Armenia with the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict that has been re-escalating over the past years, and of course Ukraine active, as we all know. Just to highlight also whether these countries, where they stand in terms of their wish to join the EU and NATO, or EU-NATO accession. Indeed, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine have been in discussions to be, to join those organizations. But just to highlight that neither Armenia or Azerbaijan have so far made any expressed any wish in that direction. Armenia was a long-standing Russian ally, basically until 2023, approximately. Now the foreign policy has started to change a little bit more towards the West. Also because they felt, abandoned by the Russian Federation in September 2023. There was the Azerbaijani military offensive that took back the Karabakh region, and since then Armenia has been shifting towards the West. But until then, it was really very much a Russian ally. And again, both Azerbaijan and Armenia are not to join NATO or EU. Just also to put it into perspective of how they compare in terms of their aspirations in that regard. to show on the map where are these conflict regions, what are we, where are they located. I didn't create the subsequent maps, but just to show, to give, to visually put it, this is the Abkhazia and South Ossetia regions in Georgia. As I said, all of these conflicts, actually, they have more historical roots, but they really escalated after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, when there were military or there were wars in the 1990s. In Georgia specifically, it sort of calmed down a little bit in the early 2000s, but then re-escalated in 2008. Some of you might remember the Russian-Georgian War, after which Russia recognized both regions as independent states, and also placed and maintains a military presence on the ground. And there have been these discussions within the Geneva International, these negotiations within the Geneva International discussions, but the conflict remains very much frozen and present. Similar with Armenia and Azerbaijan, again, the conflict has more historical roots, but really escalated in the 1990s with a war during which Armenian troops took control of Karabakh region. And then since 2016, we've seen a series of wars between Armenia and Azerbaijan, 2016, 2020, and also in the last one was the Azerbaijani military actions in September 2023, when they took back full control of the Karabakh region. But there were still Russian peacekeepers on the ground. So just to highlight again that there were Russian troops on the ground that Azerbaijan has been sort of working to also expel. And yeah, it's quite interesting. I was as I said, the last military offensive was in September 2023. I was in Azerbaijan in October 2023, so just after that. It was very interesting. And also in Armenia in January and February in 2024. So I really was right on the ground after what had been happening, which made the data collection very interesting. So now, after these conflicts that I showed here in the Caucasus, just to also explain Moldova. Moldova is very much often overlooked, but very strategically important also in the context of what's been happening in Ukraine. You see its location right here. And there is the Transnistrian region that, again, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, there was a separatist Russian-speaking minority in the eastern part of Moldova. There was a war between Moldova and the Transnistrian region, and after which Russia placed military troops in Transnistria, and Transnistria has since been operating as a de facto independent state. It is unrecognized, but it has its own government. It has its own central bank, its own currency, as I will show a bit later. Yeah, like I said, Russia maintains military, or there is Russian military presence in this separatist region in Moldova as well. To move from this context of what these conflicts are about and where also they are and how they are maybe interconnected, just to say that in terms of inclusion and participation of women in peace-building efforts, there are several commitments of the international community and of the individual states to increase participation of women. So we have UN Security Council Resolution 1325 from the year 2000, so almost 25 years ago adopted, that has been, so this resolution has been adopted on the international level, but has been implemented in each of those countries in the form of national action plans. So those are action plans that stipulate that these countries would want to increase participation of women in all matters of peace and security and defense. So on paper, we have these commitments, but the participation of women, as my research found, is really mostly limited to the so-called track 2 and 3 levels of the peace process. So in these negotiations, we have the high-level track 1. Those are the high-level negotiations. Then we have 1.5 expert-level negotiations, and then we have track 2 and 3 that are civil society and grassroots initiatives, peace-building initiatives. And there, women have been very active, also because it's easier to organize. It has more to do with humanitarian issues or social issues, education, health, children, and so on. But when it comes to the high-level negotiations on peace and security, on security and defense, on how to deal with the Russian military presence, borders, and so on, women have been rather underrepresented in those high levels of the discussions. So a bit on my methodology, or the methodology of my research. Just briefly, I was very lucky to be based in Estonia for the past 3 years. Well, 2. I was based there for 2 years before I came here, but I moved to Estonia 5 months after the start of the war in Ukraine. It was an extremely interesting environment, NATO frontline to the Russian Federation, and also an excellent connection to the post-Soviet, all of these post-Soviet countries that I wanted to study. Why? Because 35 years ago, they were one country, right? They were the Soviet Union. So I was lucky to be able to go and do field work, almost 4 months of field work in total on the ground in the countries that I wanted to study. I was a visiting researcher and lecturer in these institutions, higher education institutions that I've listed here. Of course, my research is in no way connected to them. It's independent research, but that's how I was able to, with support, also be in those countries, identify interviewees on very high level, because, as I said, I wanted to look at, high level negotiations, and I was able to conduct over 130 expert interviews in English and in Russian. Why do I mention Russian? Because Russian is still very much the lingua franca of this space, right? And this also, I just wanted to highlight the persistent connection and the influence also that the Russians still have, also through language, right? Because the older generation, often they speak the national language, so Georgian, of course, Georgian, Armenian, Azerbaijani, and Romanian, but Russian is still the second spoken language, and so you can get quite far, with Russian in this region. Just to show what the connection still is. My interviewees came from 4 different groups. So I interviewed public sector. By that I mean ministries, members of parliament. So, for example, Ministry of Defense, Foreign Affairs. Usually there is always one ministry that deals with the reintegration of the separatist region into the country. And also members of parliament, judiciary, and so on. I was able to interview international organizations, so officials from the EU, the UN, and other international organizations that prefer to stay anonymous, also international embassies and so on, civil society organizations and think tanks, and academics that also gave a bit of a more neutral and sort of academic perspective on, for example, I interviewed historians, foreign experts on foreign policy, experts on nationalism, and also women's issues in society. So I really try to have a very good database of very many different interviewees from these 4 groups. And yes, I just want to show a couple of pictures from the fieldwork very briefly to move on to the other content. But just to show, what is the reality on the ground. So I want to show, for example, this picture that really highlights also the legacy of the Soviet Union in those countries, right? So we have this kind of more Soviet-style buildings. Of course, much of the infrastructure is now being rebuilt or changed in those countries, but we do often see still what the Soviet Union has left behind. And one of the things that I think is often forgotten, and because in the West, the end of the Cold War is often portrayed as, this great moment in history. And yes, of course, but what it meant for these countries in the post-Soviet region was basically a severe economic crisis from this transition after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, when the economy changed completely, and until the early 2000s, these countries had to struggle with the economic situation, which also leads to them really being still rather subject to poverty until this day, also influencing, for example, issues in society like poverty-induced domestic violence and so on. It's changing, but just to highlight that this really, the Soviet legacy is still very much, present and shouldn't be forgotten when we speak about this region, what it actually means that they were members of the former Soviet Union. Also, just because often students ask me how it was to do fieldwork, how maybe they can conduct fieldwork in these countries. I just wanted to show that it's not necessarily a walk in the park all the time. Of course, it's extremely interesting, but here it was I got into a car crash in Moldova, so luckily nothing happened. But of course, it's not it's you have to be a little bit, how do you say, resilient when you go and you really want to do a meaningful data collection. And also I wanted to highlight the presence of war in those countries. So what these conflicts mean, just to show that this is not something abstract. I think sometimes when we talk about wars, or strategy or big power politics, we forget that war is something very real. And this was in Yerevan, you see the poster of the tanks or even the graffiti of the soldier, just to also to highlight Azerbaijan and Armenia are some of the most heavily militarized countries in the world. So there are, war is very present, and also war rhetoric. So this was Artsakh is the Armenian term for the Nagorno-Karabakh region. This was in Yerevan airport. You see the Artsakh liquor that is being advertised. On the other hand, in Azerbaijan, you go into a supermarket and you see the soda bottles with Karabakh is Azerbaijan and a taste of victory. So just to highlight that, the war rhetoric or the presence of these conflicts very much exists in those countries. And you also only see that when you do fieldwork, right? When you go and you spend some time in those countries, that's when you recognize then when we see such things. Also, just to stress again this concept of the in-betweens that is often used in scholarship to show the protests in Georgia in 2003 that have been ongoing also until now, with society being more EU, leaning towards the EU, but the government recently changing and leaning more towards Russia. So really this kind of push and pull effect that exists in those countries. Also in Moldova, where you see the NATO flag and also this commitment to the EU. And finally, just to not spend too much time on this, I just wanted to show, the reality of Transnistria. So this is the Transnistrian currency. I was interviewing a human rights organization working in Transnistria, and they showed me, what they used to pay in Transnistria, the Transnistrian ruble. So this is basically money that doesn't exist from a central bank that doesn't or is not recognized in a country that doesn't exist or isn't recognized, but still this is what what they used to pay. So it exists, but it's just internationally unrecognized. And yeah, just to highlight, to show some pictures. Yes, and this is just from my time in Yerevan. Again, for those who wish to do field work, just to advise to not do it in winter. I conducted 34 interviews in Yerevan, and it was extremely cold in January and February of 2024. It was very difficult to get from one interviewee to the other. And so I advise to pick the time to do field work always very strategically, or if you want to avoid these kind of snowstorms. Okay, so moving on to some of the results from my work. Again, I set out to look into several aspects of the participation of women in the in peace building or in peace negotiations in those regions. And I was particularly interested. So despite of having all of these commitments on paper, Resolution 1325, national action plans, so many statements made that we want to increase participation of women, what are the concrete reasons for the ongoing exclusion of women from peace processes? And based on these 130 interviews that I conducted, my research finds several key reasons for the ongoing exclusion of women from peace processes. So one of them that I tried to highlight now with the first part of the presentation is the structure of the peace processes that I'll talk about again in a minute, then the issue of empowerment, and then cultural factors. And I use sort of on the more theoretical side of things, I used Professor Fisher-Yoshida's communication model that shows the interaction of these different spheres of culture, context, self, and other, and different dimensions of communication and perception in a conflict context. And I adapted this model to show the dimensions of exclusion as an intersection of self, other, context, and culture. So we can look into the reasons, or we can systematize the reasons for exclusion by using these spheres, is what I'm arguing. And I wanted to show just briefly, based on two publications of mine on the case of Georgia and on Armenia, that I always found, these three main reasons as the main reasons for the low numbers of women in peace negotiations in this space. The first one, like I said, context. Again, I try to explain the geopolitical realities to highlight the structure of the peace process. So it's very much elite dominated, and also because of the negotiation formats, it is position based. The Geneva International Discussions or the 5+2 or the Minsk process, they're official negotiation formats that where participation requires you to be, for example, well, heads of state or government, foreign minister, deputy foreign minister, or very high level diplomats also participate in track 1, track 1.5. And those positions are usually held by men. So if you have a peace process that is structured like that, where the focus is very much on the track 1, and this is just necessary because of the geopolitical realities, right? You have to negotiate borders, you have to negotiate what to do with the Russian troops, you have to negotiate security guarantees. The participation, when it is position based, then it can lead to an exclusion of women and low participation of women. As I said, we also have a focus on issues of national security as opposed to human security for the reasons that I explained. And also one factor that came out of the interview data is, potentially the lack of political will for resolution of these conflicts. Why? Because, as long as these conflicts are kept alive, if one might argue, you also have a persistent Russian military presence in those regions, which means the control of those regions and the control of those countries as well. So there is, or many of the experts in the region argue that there is also a bit of a lack of political will for resolution, which means that there is a lack for an effective peace process, including women, could mean that, we have an effective peace process. There are various benefits of including women to achieve sustainable solutions. But if you have a lack of political will for an effective and sustainable peace process, then that makes things more difficult. I will not go too much into the cultural reasons, but just because it will take too much time, but it is linked mostly to stereotypes about women. But just to highlight also the second group of reasons for exclusion, which is also linked to Beth's work. Just trying to change the slide. on perception of self and other of women in negotiations, and the issue of empowerment. So how women perceive themselves in negotiations, and also the stories which women tell themselves in negotiations. And this can be on any topic. Again, like I said, Professor Fisher-Yoshida's work highlights this in negotiations more generally, but also in negotiations on peace and security, or in these high-stakes negotiations. One of the things that came out from the interview data was that women frequently said that they, for example, they themselves, or in when they observed others, felt that there was a lack of, for example, confidence, or having certain stories which you tell yourself about how you can participate, how competent you are to participate. It's also linked to the issue of linking women peace and security to youth peace and security, because of course this occurs more in when you're a bit younger. You maybe lack the confidence, you lack the knowledge also on how to be included. And the international organizations in the region that work or that work on these topics, they often have negotiation academies for women where they really work on the issue of empowerment, and empowering women to participate, but also really placing an emphasis on teaching or maybe not necessarily teaching, but just educating about the geopolitical realities, so that women can participate in those negotiations that are not only linked to children and health and social matters and humanitarian issues, but really the negotiations about national security and borders and defense and so on, where women want to participate. Because that's the other thing that came from the interview date, or that was often stressed in the interviews, is that, of course, the humanitarian issues are important, but women really want to participate also in those places where the decisions on the track 1 level issues, or track 1.5 level issues are made. I think I've spoken for almost half an hour at this point, so I will come to the end. And just to show, because now I think it was quite heavy with content, and also I just wanted to show some of the pictures from these countries last in a couple of minutes, because there is a lot of beauty and so many interesting cultural elements to this space. As you might have noticed, it's really close to my heart, and I think that the region should move to really finding sustainable, peaceful solutions, and hopefully, moving past the conflicts that have been persisting for 30 years, and that arguably the world or the international community maybe doesn't really pay, or often doesn't really pay sufficient attention to. So that's it, and I hope we can have a discussion.
Great, thank you so much. So yeah, we'll have a brief discussion, but I also see that there are a couple of questions that we probably want to pay attention to. And one of the things that, there are so many things you highlight here, but one of the things that continues to be a question about how do we address this disparity is it the individual? So do we, sometimes people say blame the woman, or do we, sort of build up the skill set and the knowledge of the woman, and or do we approach it systemically? Because one of the things that from your work that really intrigues me is that one of the reasons that women are not more present in track 1 is because they're not in those ranks politically. So if they're not in the ranks, then they're not in the pool of people to be called upon. So it's just an interesting point, and something to keep in mind, and also the whole influence of it being post-Soviet and that idea, because every country or every culture in the world has its own unique qualities, but there's something consistent about having been part of the former Soviet Union that is common across the countries you're looking at. So we have somebody who's written a couple of different things, so I'll just focus on one at the beginning. We have a person who's an Armenian American from California, and she graduated SUMA, which is the Sustainability Management Program. And you can see here that she's did an agricultural Fulbright and is still living in Armenia. And she has an interesting comment here, and also afterwards, is looking at the rhetoric about Artsakh, is it more extreme in Azerbaijan or Armenia, and the fake news and information about the NKR conflict? So if you can comment on your experience of that conflict in the context of Azerbaijan and Armenia, that would be great.
On the, yes. So the rhetoric on comparing comparing Azerbaijan to Armenia, it's very difficult for me to say which one. I would say that both countries, where the conflict rhetoric is very present in both countries, almost to an equal extent, I would argue. And it was especially politically charged when I was doing the interviews, of course, because, as I said, I was in Azerbaijan in October 2023, just after the military action in September. And then I was in Armenia in January and February of 2024, which was also in the immediate aftermath of having lost the Nagorno-Karabakh territory. Unfortunately, the rhetoric is very harsh sometimes, but also one thing that I noticed in my research, especially among female interviewees, was that was where there was more of an acknowledgement that we need to move away from these hard fronts and really move towards peace. Of course, it's a historical issue. It's a very long-standing conflict, again, since the 90s. And I wouldn't be able to compare where the rhetoric is harsher, but there was an acknowledgement in both countries among interviewees, I said female, but also male, that we need to move beyond these extreme positions and find a constructive way forward.
Well, that's hopeful.
Mm.
And another question is, what are the incentives for women to get involved in the peace building process? Meaning, like, what's in it for them? For those who do, what were the factors of success for recruiting them?
Mm-hmm.
A different take on it.
So why to be involved? Many women said that they're just, that they want to have agency. Many women are experts on the geopolitics, right? So they have a lot of expertise that they can contribute. And seeing as these conflicts have remained unresolved for the past 30 years when men have been at the table, they also make a very convincing argument that including them might actually move the process forward towards more peaceful solutions. So I think that's one of the main, from what I remember from the interview data, that was one of the main motivations, that they really see, just as I highlighted in the presentation, right? The region suffers very much from the fact that these conflicts remain unresolved. And as I said, experts argue that the Russian Federation is very much benefiting from the fact that they remain unresolved. So finding peaceful solutions is in the interest of everyone. And I think women recognize this, and that's why they also want to be involved in this, finding peaceful solutions. And I forgot the second part of the question.
No, then how do they get involved? So I think
How?
part
Mhm.
of in thinking about resistance, right? So there's a resistance in general about women being involved. It could be from the women, it could be from anybody else, and then looking at some of the research on resistance, it's like the balance of increasing persuasion, or I should say influence, right? So increasing persuasion to influence or reducing resistance. So I think we have to think about both of those things. It's not just to continue pushing and sort of driving hard the motivation of, no, it's really good, it's beneficial, and so on, because I think sometimes people's narratives just become more resistant. The more we push to try to persuade, the more resistant they become. So I think we have to look at what is that resistance made of? Like, why is there resistance? Some of it is just lack of information, just lack of knowledge about it. Some of it is a feeling of fear or threat to one's position, that if somebody else comes into that space, I lose some power there. So lots of different myths and realities that I think we need to address going forward in order for those spaces to open up, to lower the resistance, because as we can see, there's so much possibility that's just not being acted upon. So I think some of that has to come in there too, in that way.
Yeah.
Somebody asked the question of how does one get involved? That's kind of a general question, and I think we could take it in the general way because it's hard to hone in on one thing. But in general, if you had to make a recommendation of a woman came to you and said, Julia, I'm trying to get involved in this, but I don't know how, from any one of those states, what would you
Yeah.
say?
Yeah, so that's what I was trying to explain in explaining the negotiation formats, right? So that's why it's so difficult to have inclusion of women on the highest level, because and that's why the presence of women is more on the track, the so-called track 2 and 3 of the peace process, because it's easier to get involved in a grassroots organization or a civil society organization. It is much more difficult to rise in the ranks to high political positions, and that's why we have to look at what are, the obstacles there. So to participate in the high level negotiations, of course, you have to be in one of these positions. So that's what I was trying to show. And I recently spoke with someone who's an expert on mediation, and I asked him, what do you think are the main reasons for exclusion? And this was the first point he made. He said, look, to be in those high level negotiations, you have to be in these high positions, and it's difficult often for women to move there. Now, I'm not saying that there are not women, and that's why this is not the only reason for exclusion, because there are very many skilled and qualified women in those high positions, but then they're still not being sent to these negotiations for different reasons. And that's like I said, again, cultural empowerment, stereotypes, and so on.
Yeah, it's not one blanket reason, but there are multiple reasons there. Okay, so another question. I think we have time for one more question here.
Mhm.
When it comes to the actual peace agreement negotiations, for instance, the current peace process between Armenia and Azerbaijan, what lessons can the South Caucasus post-Soviet conflict management processes learn from the Colombia FARC process by bringing women and victims to the table? How viable do you think that is for the region? So in the Havana talks, there were
Yeah.
different groups represented in those conversations. Not that all of that has been implemented, but at least they were part of the conversation.
I mean, even thinking whether maybe you want to answer this question, Beth, because you're more an expert on Colombia. But I think that the context differs, and that's also something I tried to highlight in the presentation, because of just the fact that the Russian Federation is there. They have an interest in maintaining troops on the ground. They have, or experts argue that they have this, or have this interest. They have an interest in keeping these conflicts destabilized. They are part of the negotiation formats, and so it is very difficult to break down and also to open up the process. The processes for now, the negotiation processes have been very close. Often they have been secretive. And often that's also one thing that has led, and that's something that I highlight in my publications, is also the culture of diplomacy in this region, where negotiations are not just conducted on the negotiation table, but also, in Georgia, we have this extremely nice supraculture of the Georgian feast, and many negotiations or many agreements are then reached over wine or dinner, where women are often sidelined or excluded or not, participating in these informal formal negotiations, right? So I think that's maybe also a cultural element to this space. Although again, culture, it's a very controversial concept, and I'm aware that many scholars argue that we cannot simplify it to say that culture leads to exclusion, but it's maybe a diplomatic culture, and it's a specific structure and a specific geopolitical reality in this region that conditions the way in which these negotiations are led, that make it very difficult for women to be involved on the high level. Again, they're very active on the grassroots and civil society level. And if you were to open up the process, then of course you could have them included. But then on the other hand, as I said, you have to, in this context, negotiate borders. You have to negotiate the Russian troops, the security guarantees. So it's also difficult to have too many stakeholders in the room when you talk about these national security issues. So that's what what maybe is a response to that. I'm not sure if that was.
No, it is. And I think that every place has its unique characteristics that we have to pay attention to. So as you're talking, and I'm thinking about the Colombian peace process, there are different phases, right? And there were many Colombian peace processes. The Havana one is the one that is the most well known, because that's when an agreement was signed with FARC. But in the different phases, you also have like who's brought to the table, who's included, how do they show up in the negotiation? Is it just like an image, like an optic that, oh, look, we have these people here, or are they really taken seriously? Are their ideas really put into consideration? And then after all of that, and after you come to some kind of agreement, after a lot of efforts at negotiation, then you have to think about, well, then what happens? Because Colombia stumbled on the implementation of some of what happened because of who was in charge, the president and so on. So that was in 2016, it was signed, and now we're in 2025. So, what has happened? There's a lot that has happened in the country to have things done, but there was like a 4-year period after the signing when things kind of slowed down. So it's not only bringing people there, but it's also how seriously are they taken and what is the access, right? And so when you talk about civic and grassroots levels in track 2 and 3, the access is much more open, that it's much easier to get in there. And I think we have to think about ways, this is a future project, right? Think about ways to strategize how to bring people, women in particular, from those levels up. How do we, or even if they're representing a grassroots or a civic society, how do we get them at a table or the table, whatever table we're talking about here, to really be taken seriously and be part of a conversation, even if they're not representing a country, like as a state, the head of state, they can still play a very vital role because their perspectives are still interesting, and people in the grassroots level have different ideas and different perspectives, being on the front line, so to speak, that they can bring into the conversation that are much more nuanced because they're from actual lived experience, which is a different lived experience than people involved in the track 1 levels.
Yeah.
So I just want to say that we are out of time. We are not going to be able to answer the remaining Q&A, but please feel free to reach out to Julia, to the NECR program. And I know that we are going to have an opportunity now for those of you more interested in the program to stay on, and David will speak with you. In addition, we will have a link sent out and available on the website to hear the recording of this webinar, and we encourage you to not only have another listen, but also to recommend it to other people. So I want to thank you, Julia, thank you so much for being able to join us today and talk about this really interesting topic, and good luck with completing your dissertation, pulling it all together.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and as Beth mentioned, anyone is really welcome to reach out to me. I'm happy to discuss this topic, also to receive input. And I thank you very much for being here today and for listening.
Thank you.